A few years back, I decided to hike and camp on a remote mountain in Maine. The peak had a beautiful pond at the top, a hidden gem not many people knew about. It was just me and my dog, Max, a loyal German shepherd who always kept me company on my adventures. We reached the top by late afternoon, and I set up camp near the pond. After a simple meal, I hung my hammock between two sturdy trees while Max settled down on the ground below me. The night was calm, the air crisp, and the stars bright. Exhausted from the day's hike, I drifted off to sleep quickly, comforted by the presence of my dog nearby. In the dead of night, I was jolted awake by Max's frantic barking. His barks were sharp and filled with urgency. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of the situation. Then I heard it, a loud grunt, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush. The noise was terrifying, and I could hear the distinct sound of a tree falling. Max's barking intensified, each bark echoing into the night. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam revealed a massive black bear about 50 feet away. The bear was huffing and grunting, clearly agitated. My mind raced as I remembered the whistle in my North Face backpack. Desperately, I grabbed it and blew as hard as I could. The shrill sound pierced the night, and the bear hesitated before retreating toward the pond. In the faint light of my flashlight, I could see its eyes glinting from a distance. For the next 2 hours, the bear circled the area, moving behind me and then back toward the pond. I tried to keep the fire blazing as high as possible, hoping it would keep the bear at bay. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had a cub with it. Maybe the noise I heard was the cub climbing a dead tree and then falling. Suddenly, the sky opened up and it started to pour. The rain was relentless, and my fire quickly fizzled out. Soaked and shivering, I huddled under a tarp with Max. The darkness felt suffocating, and though I couldn't see the bear anymore, I thought I could still hear it moving around. The adrenaline that had kept me going started to fade, replaced by exhaustion. Despite my fear, I fell into a restless sleep. The first light of dawn stirred me awake. The rain had stopped, leaving everything soaked. Every muscle in my body ached, and my mind was still clouded with the events of the night. I packed up as quickly as I could, my movements hurried and nervous. Max stayed close, his ears perked up, alert for any sign of danger. As we made our way down the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. It felt like an eternity, but finally, we reached the base of the mountain. Exhausted and drenched, I climbed into my car with Max, the sense of relief overwhelming. Driving away, I glanced back at the mountain, shrouded in mist. The terror of the night still clung to me, but the daylight brought a sense of safety. The encounter with the bear had been a stark reminder of nature's unpredictability and power. I knew it would be a long time before I ventured back into the wilderness alone again. Hiking the Appalachian Trail one summer, I found myself deep in the heart of Vermont. The sun had long set, and it was nearing 11:30 p.m. when I stumbled upon an old white fire tower that was marked as a night camp on my map. Exhausted and ready to rest, I was relieved to see the structure standing tall against the night sky. As I approached the fire tower, my headlamp flickered and went out, plunging me into near darkness. I cursed my luck but kept moving, guided by the faint outline of the building against the stars. When I stepped inside, my breath caught in my throat. The interior looked like a perfectly preserved snapshot from the 1920s. Wool blankets were neatly folded on an old iron bunk, an Osborne fire finder sat on a wooden table, and a kerosene lantern flickered softly, casting shadows on the walls. There was even food on an old tin plate, and an old Forest Service pack slumped in the corner. It was like stepping into a museum exhibit. Clearly, someone had been here recently. The food on the plate was fresh. My fatigue won over my curiosity, and I decided to stay the night. I settled onto the bunk, pulling the wool blanket over me. The place had an odd, comforting warmth, and despite the strangeness of it all, I quickly fell asleep. I woke up at 7 the next morning, feeling surprisingly well rested. As I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, I realized something was off. The room was cold, and a draft was coming from somewhere. I sat up and looked around, my heart beginning to race. Everything was gone. The wool blankets, the food, the lantern, the Osborne fire finder, the pack in the corner, all of it had vanished. I was no longer on the bunk but lying on the wooden floor. The fire tower was completely empty, and the windows were boarded up. The air inside was musty and stale, and dust motes danced in the early morning light streaming through the cracks in the boards. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. My pack was still with me, untouched. I noticed a piece of paper pinned to the wall near where the bunk had been. I walked over and read the note, my hands shaking. "Thanks for spending the time, it's been a while." A chill ran down my spine. The neat handwriting was old-fashioned, the ink slightly faded. I stepped back, feeling a surge of panic. It was as if the tower had been frozen in time the night before, only to revert to its abandoned state by morning. I grabbed my pack and bolted out of the fire tower, my heart pounding in my chest. The morning air outside was crisp, and the forest seemed indifferent to my terror. I forced myself to calm down, took a deep breath, and started hiking back down the trail. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. As I walked, the events of the night played over and over in my mind. The perfectly preserved interior, the sudden disappearance of everything, the eerie note, it all felt like a strange dream. But the chill in my bones told me it was all too real. I reached a small trailhead town by midday, where I took a moment to rest and gather my thoughts. The locals were friendly, but when I mentioned the fire tower, their expressions turned somber. One old man told me that the tower had been abandoned for decades, and no one went there anymore. He said some hikers claimed it was haunted, but I didn't need his stories to believe it. As I continued my hike along the Appalachian Trail, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder of how thin the veil between past and present can be. I'll never forget the fire tower and the eerie message left behind. It was a night that made me realize just how strange and mysterious the world can be, and it left me with a story I would carry with me forever. I decided to take a solo hiking trip into the dense woods of northern Michigan. I had always found solitude in nature to be calming, a way to clear my mind from the daily grind. That particular weekend, I planned to camp overnight deep in the forest. The day was perfect, clear skies, cool breeze, and the scent of pine in the air. I hiked for several hours, enjoying the peaceful surroundings and the occasional sightings of wildlife. As the sun began to set, I found a suitable spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire to cook dinner. After eating, I sat by the fire, watching the stars slowly appear in the night sky. It was the kind of tranquil moment I had come here for. Eventually, the fire started to die down, and I decided to get some sleep. As I lay in my tent, the forest around me grew quieter, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I drifted off to sleep, feeling secure in my secluded spot. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had stirred me, but I felt an uneasy sensation. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cool night air. The forest was pitch black, and the only sounds were the gentle whisper of the wind and the rustling of leaves. As I scanned my surroundings with the flashlight, the beam caught something white and eerie in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. I took a few cautious steps closer and realized it was a deer skull, perched on a fallen log. Its hollow eye sockets seemed to stare right through me, and its presence in the middle of the forest at night was unsettling. I stood frozen for a moment, the beam of my flashlight fixed on the skull. The sight of it in the dark woods was creepy as hell. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The logical part of my brain tried to convince me it was just an old skull, probably dragged there by some animal. But the part of me steeped in childhood fears couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, I heard a faint crunching sound behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes, the darkness playing tricks on my mind. Every shadow looked like a lurking figure, and every sound felt like it was creeping closer. I backed towards my tent, never taking my eyes off the surrounding woods. Once inside, I zipped it up quickly and huddled in my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing heart. I lay there, listening intently for any more sounds, but the night seemed to have swallowed them all. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As the first light of dawn seeped through the fabric of my tent, I felt a wave of relief. I packed up my gear hurriedly, my eyes constantly darting around. The forest that had felt so inviting during the day now seemed sinister and oppressive. I hiked back to my car with a sense of urgency, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I felt an immense sense of relief. I threw my backpack in the trunk and drove away, the tension slowly leaving my body. Looking back, I realize how naive I was to think the forest at night would be the same as during the day. That deer skull, just an ordinary part of nature, had tapped into a primal fear that lurks in all of us. It's a reminder that sometimes, the scariest things are not what we see, but what our minds conjure up in the dark. That night taught me a valuable lesson: respect the wilderness and never underestimate the power of fear. It wasn't what I saw, but what I heard. I decided to do an hour hike up to a mountain peak in Tuching, Taiwan. It was late, and I was alone, a really stupid thing to do, in hindsight. The hike up to the top was problem-free. The view was amazing, the air was clear, and I could see the stars. It felt like a perfect night. But the way down was a different story. About a quarter of the way down, I heard a horrible sound and saw a bunch of rustling in the bushes right next to me. I don't know what it was, but it sounded like a monkey being savagely torn apart by a lion. The noise was absolutely terrifying. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, instinct took over, and I started running down the mountain as fast as I could. In my panic, I reached a fork in the trail. I turned right, knowing either path would eventually lead me back to my scooter. But after a little while, I started to hear barking. The barking grew louder and more insistent. It wasn't just one dog, it sounded like a pack of feral dogs, and they seemed to be coming up the mountain towards me. Panic surged through me again. I turned around and sprinted back up the mountain to the fork, all the while trying to push the earlier horrific sound out of my mind. I took the other path, praying it would be free of any more surprises. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare slow down. The fear of what might be behind me kept me moving. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow cast by my flashlight, made my heart skip a beat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint glimmer of my scooter's reflective decals. Relief washed over me, but I didn't let my guard down. I jumped on the scooter, started it up, and sped away as quickly as possible, not daring to look back. Riding down the road, the night seemed darker and more menacing than before. My heart was still racing, and my mind replayed the events over and over. I couldn't believe how reckless I had been to hike up there alone at night. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I sat down, trying to calm my nerves. The terror of that night stayed with me, a harsh lesson learned. Going up there at night is something I will never do again, not even with a big group of people. I still beat myself up for how stupid I was to go up there by myself. The experience left me wary of night hikes forever. The memory of those terrifying sounds, and the fear of what might have been lurking in the darkness will haunt me for a long time. My family's property was right next to some old logging trails. When I was a teenager, I'd go hiking on nights when I couldn't sleep, just to scare myself a little. The thrill of the dark woods always had a strange allure. One night, I went out with the moon nearly full, its light casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. It was bright enough that I didn't bother bringing a flashlight. The air was cool, and the silence was only broken by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. I walked about a mile into the woods, enjoying the stillness, when I heard some rustling and a low growling coming from just off the trail. The sound was familiar. It wasn't big enough to be a bear, so I figured it was probably coyotes. I wasn't too worried. My curiosity got the better of me, so I moved closer to see what was going on. Sure enough, 2 coyotes scampered away as I approached. But what they left behind made my blood run cold. The kill they had been feasting on was another coyote, but it looked like some sort of sacrifice. The poor animal had been sliced open and placed on a stump, with its skin nailed down in a star pattern. Its head and feet were removed and placed in the center, and its guts were spilling out in a grotesque display. The scene looked fresh, the blood not yet dried, probably killed no more than a day or 2 before. A wave of nausea hit me, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The sight was something out of a nightmare, a macabre scene that didn't belong in these woods. I turned and sprinted home as fast as I could, the image burned into my mind. The next day, I told my dad about what I had seen. He didn't say much, but his face turned serious. We called the local park ranger, and he agreed to come with us to check it out. As we made our way back to the spot, the daylight made the woods seem less menacing, but my nerves were still on edge. When we arrived, the ranger examined the scene carefully. He confirmed what I had dreaded. It looked like some kind of ritual killing. The precise way the coyote had been mutilated, the arrangement on the stump, it all pointed to something more deliberate than a predator's kill. After documenting the scene and taking a few photos, the ranger assured us he would report it and keep an eye on the area. But beyond that, there wasn't much more he could do. It was a disturbing mystery with no clear answers. My dad and I walked back home in uneasy silence. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Every rustle in the woods, every distant howl of a coyote, brought back the memory of that night. I kept my nighttime hikes to a minimum, sticking close to home when I did venture out. Time passed, and while the memory of that gruesome discovery never left me, the fear eventually faded. I never saw anything like it on my walks again. But the experience left me with a heightened awareness of the darker possibilities lurking in the woods. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones we stumble upon when we least expect it.